Welcome to HortTube, where we talk all things gardening. My name is Jim Putnam, and this is a Blue Pacific Juniper. This is Blue Pacific Juniper, a shore juniper that grows almost flat to the ground, stays evergreen, and has a blue-green foliage. Blue Pacific junipers stay less than a foot tall and can grow pretty much as wide as you want to let them get. If you're spacing them for a ground cover, the proper spacing is probably between 4 and 6 feet in width to cover it within 2 or 3 years. You could probably go a little further than that, or you could go closer than that if you're very impatient. In terms of cold hardiness, like all junipers, Blue Pacific is extremely cold hardy. It's not quite as cold hardy as some of the other varieties, but it is very cold hardy. I would say zones 5 to 9 would be ideal for this plant. Some of the other junipers can go into zones 3 and 4, but these shore junipers don't seem to be quite as cold tolerant, but zone 5 is still pretty cold in the wintertime, and these will hold up well there. Like most other ground cover junipers, Blue Pacific is kind of slow growing, really. I think we might get about 6 inches of width on these in the ground each year. And so your spacing will be determined by your patience, really. Every foot apart that you put these, it's probably going to take a year to establish them as a ground cover. So if they're 6 feet apart, you may have, and they're already, a foot and a half wide when you plant them, it's probably going to take about 4 years to fill it in. If they're 4 feet apart, maybe 2 years to fill them in. Blue Pacific junipers would prefer almost all day sun, at least a half a day of the midday sun. By midday, I mean anytime between 10 and 4 o'clock. The early morning sun and the late evening sun really don't count on these. They need a lot of that midday sun, and they will take all of the midday sun. These can grow in commercial parking lots. Blue Pacific junipers are typically used as ground cover, and you'll see them planted on slopes in mass. This one and blue rug are probably the two most popular for that. It's also great for planting near a wall, because these things will actually come over the edge of the wall and drape down. That's a good use for them. Also, pretty much anywhere where you need a very, very low ground cover to hold some soil in place, maybe along a sidewalk or something like that where you're getting some overwash, this would be great to hold soil in place. And you can just trim this right to the edge of the sidewalk as it tries to grow out onto it. Blue Pacific has a kind of a blue-green hue to it. The older growth has more of the bluish hue. It's really hard to show up on any kind of video or photo, really. The new growth is kind of a lime green, lighter green foliage, and the older growth below that has a blue hue to it. And it's really a nice contrast. When we're planting junipers of all types, our main consideration is that they not stay wet between rains. That's what makes them such good ground cover plants on slopes, because slopes tend to dry out between rains. If you're planting this on flat ground, anywhere along a foundation, a sidewalk, or in mass planting, any place you think it might stay wet between rains, you're definitely going to elevate these when you plant them. And that means digging the hole, the depth of the root ball, and then putting some of the loose soil back in the bottom, maybe 2 inches of that loose soil back in the bottom, so that when you set the plant into the hole, it actually sticks up about 2 inches. And then we'll pull our soil up to the edge of that. And that'll make sure that the crown of this plant, where it goes into the ground, is never going to stay wet between rains. It's always going to, the water's going to slope away from it in all directions. We definitely don't want to over mulch this plant. If pine straw is available in your area, that's what I would mulch my junipers with. Especially early on while we're trying to cover a slope, I just wouldn't use a lot of heavy, thick hardwood mulch, the brown mulch or the red mulch. It's just going to hold too much water in place, and these will be off color. They won't grow as well. You'll create a lot of issues. You can create a lot of issues by over mulching these. Another issue you may find on Blue Pacific junipers and most junipers is they could be root bound when you pull them out of container, meaning the roots are really tightly wound around one another. If that's the case when you pull it out of the container, you're going to want to pull at those quite a bit to try to get them to go outward. If it's too bad, you can actually cut into the root ball several times with a knife from the top to the bottom, maybe a ½ inch in, and that'll get the roots going outward. If you're planting this plant in heavy clay soils, you're going to want to mix in some pine bark soil conditioner, which is a chunky aged pine bark. It's actually what we're growing these in here. It's just an aged bark from a pine tree. It's perfect for mixing into clay and allowing water to kind of pass through the clay more easily. You're definitely going to want to do that. If you're planting this in a coastal area where it's very sandy, you might want to mix in some compost to hold a little bit of water in place, but I'm more concerned with letting this plant dry out between rains than I am holding water in place. Once your Blue Pacific junipers are established, you're really never going to have to water these if it's planted in a flat area along a foundation or wherever you've planted it, it's flat. If it's on a slope and you go 2 months during the summertime and it doesn't rain, that slope can really get to the point where even something as drought tolerant as this isn't going to like it. And if nothing else, it's going to stop the growth on it. So it's not going to have a lot of this fresh looking blue-green foliage on it. So when you plant these on a slope, it might be best to get a drip hose and go ahead and lay it down as you're planting these in whatever pattern you planted them in. Always make sure your water is above the plants, because when you water will run down the hill, of course. But a lot of people don't think about that. There's no point in watering below it. Water above it, and then it'll saturate the area below it. If you put a drip hose in place before you do this, in the future you can just hook a water hose to it and water the entire bank at one time. And you might have to do that twice every summer if it's on a steep slope, just to keep them growing and fresh looking. When you're trying to establish your Blue Pacific junipers or any of your ground cover junipers, I'd probably fertilize them twice a season. I would use a slow release fertilizer for acid-loving plants that you can find probably at any garden center, maybe in March and then again in early June. And we might be able to get about 6 or 8 inches of growth around these in a single summer if we do that and we water a couple times if it becomes super dry. Once they're to the width you need them, I would just do it once a season in the early spring, and that should be adequate. These junipers can be pruned pretty much anytime they get wider than you need them. If they get to the bottom of your hill and they're just encroaching on the space in front of them, you can just go along and cut them off anytime. If they're planted on as a foundation plant and you're just trying to keep them as a little 2-foot circle, no problem at all. I kind of like this natural form that they take without shearing on them constantly. So if you need to keep it in a 2-foot circle, maybe cut it to an 18-inch circle when you prune it, and that'll give you a couple seasons where it will take a more natural, spiky look. In terms of insect or disease problems, on junipers we will see spider mites. Mostly I only see it on stressed plants. If they're overwatered or they're in too much shade, something's going on with it, where it's over mulched. That tends to be where we see mite issues, is kind of on unhealthy plants. These are very susceptible to root rot, and one issue we have with ground cover junipers is they become their own worst enemy in time. They do such a good job of covering the ground that eventually they start to hold water in place, and that's especially true if leaves blow into them in the fall and aren't cleaned up. Those leaves will rot over time. They get trapped in the plants, and then this slope, which was originally extremely dry and nothing would grow on it, now all of a sudden holds a lot of water between rains, and they end up with root rot issues. So make sure if you have leaves falling into your ground cover junipers that you're getting them cleaned up in the fall. Make sure we're not over mulching them. And occasionally you may have to go through once every few years and just generally thin them out so that they dry out between rains. So what are you waiting for? Even you can grow the low maintenance ground cover blue-green foliage Blue Pacific juniper. Thank you for watching, and if this video was helpful, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel for future videos. Also, if you have any questions about any ground cover junipers, Blue Pacific or Blue Rug or Andorra, ask away and I'll try to help you out. Thank you.